Hello, this is Bret. Welcome back to the reading of the book, The Seventh Vial by James Aiken Wiley. We continue on page 58 in the chapter titled The Little Book. In the hand of this mighty and glorious angel was a little book open. We cannot think the interpretation of the symbol which Mr. Eliot, Dr. Keith, and others have given is the true one, being that it represents an open Bible, first given to the world at the Reformation. It is contrary to every canon of interpretation of the apocalyptic symbols to say that a book is the symbol of a book. Nor will this idea consist with the sequel. John was commanded to take the book out of the angel's hand and eat it. When he had done so, he found it sweet in the mouth but bitter in the belly. We cannot see the propriety of applying this to the publication of the scriptures at the Reformation. No sooner had John digested the book than he received a commission to prophesy again. This seems to connect the little book with the predictions that follow and to lay a ground for the supposition that these predictions formed the little book. It was pleasant to know the events contained in this book, but painful to announce them to the church, relating as they did to her long prophesying in sackcloth, and to the Edurus conflict she would be called to wage with the dragon. The church against the dragon. Remember that now. We are persuaded that the opinion held concerning the little book by Mede, in which he was followed by Virginia and Sir Isaac Newton and others, is the sound one. That opinion is substantially what we have stated. The little book naturally suggests a larger book with which it is contrasted. Had it symbolized the Bible, it would have been described simply as a book. But the little book in the angel's hand is obviously contrasted with the Lamb's book. It is represented with great propriety as a little book because the space of time comprehended in it is much shorter than included in the other. The Lamb's book comprehends, the Lamb's book comprehends the whole period from the opening of the first seal till the return of Christ to judgment. The little book comprehends only 1,260 years, or, to come near the truth, it comprehends only that part of these years which includes the rise and reign of Antichrist, for it leaves off his history when his overthrow commences. The point where the sealed roll takes it up to carry it on under the symbol of the vials, the prophecy of the little book is contained, we apprehend, in the 11th, 12th, and 13th chapters. Without this little book, the sequel of the apocalypse would scarce have been intelligible, for then we should have seen the third woe inflicted without having the object, on whom that woe fell described. We have already said that when the Western Empire was destroyed at the sounding of the fourth trumpet, the scene of judgment was transferred to the Eastern world. The fifth trumpet, or first woe trumpet. The fifth trumpet, or the first woe trumpet, was sounded, introducing the plague of the locusts and Saracens. The sixth trumpet, or second woe trumpet, was next sounded, introducing the plague of the horsemen, or Turks, by whom the Eastern Empire was destroyed. But during the infliction of these woes in the East, popery was gradually rising in the West. On it, the third woe was now to be inflicted. Therefore, it was necessary to retrograde in the symbolic narrative in order to bring up the history of affairs in the West from the time of the Western Empire. Start that sentence again. On it, the third woe was now to be inflicted. Therefore, it was necessary to retrograde in the symbolic narrative in order to bring up the history of affairs in the West from the time of the Western Empire had been overthrown. This little book does. It exhibits the rise of Antichrist and his gradual ascent to the universal dominion. Once again, and a third time, we are told the story of that eventful period. First, in the witnesses who prophesy in sackcloth are slain and rise again. Next, in the woman clothed with the sun, persecuted by a dragon and obliged to flee into the wilderness. And yet again, in the history of the beast of the sea and the beast of the earth, which last grew to such a height of power and waxed so self-willed and imperious that he would permit no one to buy or sell who did not wear his mark in his forehead or in his right hand. Thus, the prophecy is thrice given, each time under different imagery, because God has established the thing and would surely bring it to pass, and also that opportunity might be given minutely to paint Antichrist in his character and actings in order that the church might know him when he appeared. Such then is the subject of the little book. It supplies the history of some of the most important events which took place during the sounding of the fifth and sixth trumpets. That is, from the close of the fifth to the beginning of the 16th century, and the knowledge of which is essential to the right understanding of the closing acts in the great apocalyptic drama. The main objection of Mr. Eliot to this interpretation is that had the little book been prophetical, it would have been represented as closed, like the Lamb's book, and opened gradually as the other was. We do not think that there is much force in this. The true answer to it we apprehend to be that the main idea set forth in the unrolling of the sealed book was not that its contents related to the future, but that the whole administration of providence was in the hands of Christ, not as a prophet, but as he to whom it belongs to execute the purposes of God. It was unnecessary to exhibit symbolically this truth over again, and therefore the little book is represented as open, just as the roll given to Ezekiel by the river Chebar, from which this part of the imagery of the apocalypse is undoubtedly taken, was spread before him, although it contained the predictions he was to deliver to the house of Israel, and thus related to the future. Whether sealed or open, the disclosure of its contents could proceed only from him who reveals secret things to his servants. Quote, he set his right foot upon the sea and his left foot upon the earth, unquote. A striking representation this of his universal dominion as mediator. Mr. Eliot and others who make this angel the symbol of the Reformation, a most anomalous interpretation, we cannot help thinking, interpret this sea on which the right foot of the angel rested, meaning Britain, and those maritime parts of the continent, Holland, Denmark, Sweden, where the influence of the Reformation was most felt. And the earth on which the angel placed his foot as denoting the more inland parts of the continent, where the effects of the Reformation were less permanent. But this is to violate a most imperative law in symbolic interpretation, according to which the sea cannot mean the sea, but something else, nor the earth, but some other thing. Having framed a symbolic alphabet, we must adhere to it throughout and not give the same character one meaning in one passage and another meaning in another passage. In this way, we might make anything of the apocalypse, or rather, we should make nothing of it. The sea is the symbol of nations, and particularly in a state of excitement, and therefore may be here taken to denote secular society. The earth is society in its more settled state, but being that out of which the papacy arose, it is sometimes put elliptically to denote the papacy, and may be here taken to mean the ecclesiastical society. That's really interesting. I'm going to read this again. The earth is society in its more settled state, but being that out of which the papacy arose, it is sometimes put elliptically to denote the papacy, and may be here taken to mean ecclesiastical society. As the world is composed of sea and dry land, so society is made up of secular and ecclesiastical. Christ here seen standing on both, on the sea and the earth of the anti-Christian system, denoting his power over both civil and ecclesiastical society. He had his foot on the nations, and he had it planted too on Antichrist. And notwithstanding that for a long period he appeared to practice and prosper against God, Christ was all the while subserving his own purposes by him, And when these were accomplished, he trod him into the dust, quote, and cried with a loud voice, as when a lion roareth, unquote. By the voice of Christ is meant the dispensations of his providence. By these he speaks to the world. His voice was loud, majestic, terrible, as when a lion roareth. The world resounded and shook, as does wilderness when the lion roars, and its tribes became mute with terror. This denotes awful character of those events he was now to introduce, and by which he was to rebuke the nations for their sin and proclaim his power and justice. Quote, and when he had cried, 7 thunders uttered their voices, unquote. The 7 thunders, not simply 7 thunders. Various, and in some cases very extraordinary interpretations have been given of this symbol. The quote 7 thunders, unquote, says Vitringa, mean the 7 crusades, and John was commanded, he tells us, to pass over in silence what they uttered, because, quote, this is in Latin, I think, and I'm not going to read it. You can read it yourself right here. The explanation of Mr. Eliot is scarcely more satisfactory to our mind. These 7 thunders symbolize, according to him, the excommunications which the Pope launched against the reformers. And he rests not a little stress upon the fact, as vindication of his theory, that the papal bulls, in common phrase, are denominated thunders and emanate from the 7 hills. Okay, butchered that. I'm going to read it again. These 7 thunders symbolize, according to him, the excommunications which the Pope launched against the reformers. And he rests not a little stress upon the fact, a vindication of his theory, that the papal bulls, in common phrase, are denominated thunders and emanate from the 7 hills. The fault of this exposition appears to us to lie in its being too ingenious. Mr. Eliot also builds a good deal upon the circumstances of the definite article being employed, quote unquote, the 7 thunders. We submit that this bears with much greater force against than for his theory. Had the papal thunders been here symbolized, it is probable that the definite article would have been omitted, seeing they are never introduced before or after in the Apocalypse. Besides, the rise of the beast had not yet been shown, and it is contrary to all propriety to introduce his thunders or roarings before he himself had received existence. What, then, are we to understand by the 7 thunders and the command given to John to seal up what they had uttered? Let us follow the leadings of the figure. The angel speaks with a loud voice, as when a lion roareth, and the 7 thunders are the re-echo of the angel's voice, similar in character to the original sound must be the reverberations. The voice denoted the awful events of the coming dispensation, especially those that were to bring about the quote-unquote consummation. And so must the seven thunders, which were awakened by that voice. Okay, butchered that. I'm going to read that again. The voice denoted the awful events of the coming dispensation, especially those that were to bring about the consummation. And so must the seven thunders, which were awakened by that voice. They relate, we are strongly persuaded, to the plagues that were to constitute the third woe, the judgments by which the ruin of the papacy was to be accomplished. If so, they are the same as the plagues of the 7 vials, with which they correspond in point of number, and the words of the angel that follow give ground to conclude that they correspond with the vials in point of time also. That, in fact, both relate to the same events. Why, then, was it said to John, quote, "Seal up those things which the 7 thunders uttered, and write them not," unquote? Obviously, because the events they announced were to be afterwards revealed to him in symbol under the 7th trumpet. They were sealed up now because John had first to be shown the rise and reign of that terrible power on which the plagues, which the thunders announced, were to be inflicted. It would have violated the proprieties of the apocalyptic drama to write the doom before the object of that doom had arisen. These disclosures were to be introduced at their proper... I lost my place. Okay. These disclosures were to be introduced at their proper place in the apocalypse, with this difference that whereas the thunders described, most probably without any figure or metaphor, the judgments by which Antichrist was to be overthrown, the revelation afterwards made of these things was given in symbolical language. If this be the right interpretation, which we are persuaded it is, then although the things that were uttered by the 7 thunders were sealed up at that time, they are now in course of being revealed. The days in which we live are the days of the voice of the 7th angel, and the events of providence are now publishing to all men what it was unlawful then for the pen of the apostle to write. And when the hour of Antichrist's overthrow shall have arrived, we shall know more fully still what these 7 thunders uttered. Okay, so that ends the chapter of the little book. An interesting 170-year-old book we have here. So that ends the reading, and I'll come back next time. And let's see. I think we're on page... I'm sorry, I lost my place. The Oath of the Angel on page 70 will continue next time. Bye for now.